Today on Game Changers, we're joined by Stanley Pierre-Louis, President and CEO of the Entertainment Software Association. This association is a key voice and advocate of the United States video gaming industry. With a career that bridges law, media, and entertainment, Stanley brings a uniquely powerful perspective to the world of video gaming. He's not just shaping the future of gaming, but he's helping the world understand why games matter. Welcome to the show, Stanley.
Thanks for having me.
One of the things we like to do when we kick this off is we want to understand kind of where games originated for you. Can you tell us what games you kind of grew up playing, and if you still play, if you find the time in a busy schedule with the ESA, but what did gaming look like for you growing up?
Games have always been a fun part of my life and upbringing. I started off early in the early days of video game play. So I was around for the early Atari games, the Intellivision games, the ColecoVision, and just playing with friends and playing at arcades. It was back in that physical era where games were a social event where you got to connect with family and friends, but sometimes not in the home, sometimes in, the local fair, or when you're on a trip and the hotel has a game room and it includes pool and all these other things for games. And so played all the Centipedes and the Pac-Man, Ms. Pac-Mans. And so it started in that era, and it's always fun going back. I have one of these older Nintendo systems that stores games so that you can try it on the original apparatus and devices. And sometimes when you play with people, they get to see what the difficulty level was to play without the modern controller. So I've lived through several of those changes.
Nice. Do you still own any video games today?
Not from the original era. The Nintendo system I have that stored about 20, 30 games. It's something they sold as a throwback, retro game. I have that, but a lot of the older ones, through all the moves and years over life, you just don't know what to store and keep. And at some point, you've got to get the latest, greatest systems. But we've got here at the Entertainment Software Association a great little museum of older platforms for people to view and sometimes play on.
So when people are in DC, they can actually go see this in person? How do they do that?
We just maintain them in our office, and it's great for policymakers, media, and others when they're in town to be able to look at the old systems. And for many people, it's a trip down memory lane about what it was like growing up with family and friends.
Nice. That's awesome. Your career kind of spans sort of a legal background, and then you got into the music industry, and then you kind of found yourself sort of leading this association at the ESA. Can you tell us how you got into the legal side of it? Because I think that'll dovetail pretty well into, your work here at the ESA today. But how did you get into law, and what inspired you to get into that growing up?
Yeah, going to college, I was trying to decide what path I wanted to take for a career. Did I want to go into academics? Did I want to go into government? Did I want to go into something that was private sector? I wasn't really sure, and ended up studying history, but also as part of that, doing some performing arts. I'd grown up playing different instruments, playing in different groups. So the arts were always a part of my upbringing. And I continued that through college and really through law school. And when it came time to make a decision, I just looked at the ROI. If you go to get a law degree, you're 3 years and you can do lots of different things. If you do a PhD, it could be a long time. And so some of it was just practical of saying, how am I going to get through and start the career? And I had intended to practice law for some time, but I wasn't sure what that might lead into. But I love the flexibility of being able to do government, the arts, private practice, in-house, outside counsel, whatever it was. And so I took that route just because it allowed for lots of flexibility. At no point did I think I'd be heading a trade association, but I knew that I'd end up somewhere in the arts somehow, but I wasn't sure how it would work. And there have just been a lot of happy coincidences that got me into the arts and being able to do it now for over 30 years.
Yeah. And you've initially started your career in music in some way. Is that correct?
Yeah. I started off, I after law school, I clerked for a judge, and we had some IP cases. So that was intriguing. I went to a law firm after that and mainly worked on whatever the firm had. But there were some copyright related cases that would come up about fair use in quoting, publishing books, and for academic journals, those sorts of things. And eventually I ended up doing some work that involved music and theater. And that was pretty exciting. And around the same time, the Recording Industry Association of America, RIAA, was looking for an in-house litigator because they were concerned about the online use of music in unauthorized fashion. And those cases were intriguing to me. So I applied and got there. And my first day of work, we were talking about a company called Napster. And toward the end, we had concluded, 6 years later, about a company called Grokster at a case of the Supreme Court. So my career there spanned kind of Napster to Grokster and everything that came in between, mp3.com and all manner of cases. So I was just involved in-house in a lot of the litigations that the music industry had and got to work with amazing companies and amazing legal talent pursuing these cases.
Now, naturally, I never use things like Napster or LimeWire. That's, of course, never something I engaged in. That said, for my friends that did, what was that like kind of working in the music industry at the time? I mean, what a wild time for media and an entire industry that was going under, I don't want to say democratization. I mean, it was like a step change of illegality mixed with what does the future look like with the internet and distribution? What did that look like for music at the time?
Yeah, I think for the record companies, there was a lot of tension over how do you meet consumers where they are. And the world is becoming more digital, more online. And for different industries, it was a different speed. So for text-based industries, it was very fast. For music, it was not fast at first until compression technology got there. And once it got there, it also came after film and television. But in the beginning portion, those first few years, the online compression technology wasn't there. And so it was a slower uptake for consumers because you had to be very advanced and have really good computers. And, we didn't have really broadband at the beginning of all this. You had dial-up. And so it was a matter of how do you get ahead of the problem before it becomes a problem. Once broadband and compression technology changed and got better, it made the issue much more problematic for record labels because their transitions hadn't quite happened into having an online marketplace. There was no Apple store at the time, although I know it was being contemplated. And so we were trying to stay ahead of the curve using litigation techniques and anti-piracy techniques while they were trying to develop a market for it. And it was interesting. I remember talking to companies way back in the late 90s, early 2000s, like the Shazams of the world, like these companies that were like, I've got this technology where you can hear it for a snippet and you don't know where they're going to end up. And so it's, real networks was a thing for a while. It was one of the ways to play music and stream. So streaming was a possibility, but you had to have bandwidth to do that. And so there wasn't a real market for it then yet. So there were just a lot of interesting technologies. And so we got to know what was happening, but we also saw the risks associated with not turning quickly enough. And so our job at RIAA was to lead the litigation effort while the companies worked on the business models for the future. And there were lots of fits and starts of companies coming up with technologies and how do you protect your CDs while growing this other market. So it was from a lawyer standpoint who was involved in the cases, there was a lot of mission around what we did, but it was also exciting to be in the middle of it and to, make sure that what we did was dotting our I's and crossing our T's because we were going into federal court saying, this is a problem and here's what we're seeing. And we had to have our facts right. So as a lawyer, it was exciting, but I know for the industry, it was a really painful period.
People always love a good story. Is there a meeting or a moment from that period of your life that, like, meeting Shazam or dealing with Napster or a court hearing that really sticks out to you? Like, people always want to know kind of a snippet or a story from like that time. And you were kind of at the front lines of what was a transformative time of music at the time.
There are probably lots of them. I mean, I worked round the clock on these cases early in my career. And after a while, the folks at Napster knew my online ID. So sometimes they would send me nasty messages while we were online doing research. So they would know when I was on. So it was pretty funny. Like after a while, it was like this cat and mouse game where we had investigators doing things and I'd go to double check. And whenever I came on, I'd get these messages. So there are like these little things like that where you go like, that's so strange. Like, how do they know who I am and the like? But there were lots of great meetings. We got to meet artists in the Napster case. Metallica filed its own lawsuit. And so, you got to meet some of the artists who were pioneering in some of these litigations because they were one of the few recording artists who were out there early on in the cases. And then there were songwriters who were part of a pace that we brought collaboratively in these matters. And so we got to meet these legendary songwriters who saw a lot of their income diminishing because of the lack of payment for their works online. So there were a lot of kind of fun, cool meetings with them, but always around this mission to help protect their work.
Very cool. Well, we'll get to your continued involvement in music in just a second, but around the orchestra and the symphony orchestra that you're involved with. But I want to move to how you got to the ESA. Tell us that story of like, how did you make that transition? What led you to that? And what was the story of how you joined them in the first place? And then obviously the story of how you became, the president and CEO.
Music law is in many ways a really complicated area. And it's because music is split into several parts. There's the recording you hear, there are the underlying works, and there are a lot of agreements within that world that have become a way to do business. And so once you start to understand music, it starts to unpack a lot about the rest of the entertainment world, because music features so largely. Movies have music, video games have music, and people love engaging in music in different ways. It's also a smaller file compression-wise than the others. And so in many ways, we were ahead of the curve in terms of technology doing great things and doing harmful things. That gave me a really good footing to understand other areas of the IP world, of the intellectual property world, and also the impact technology would have. And really, by talking to people over time and seeing what the next opportunities were, I ended up at Viacom doing film and television work, mainly on the intellectual property protection side. But sitting in corporate, it meant that we had purview over all of our divisions: MTV, VH1, BET, Paramount Pictures, Nickelodeon. And so you're getting to understand these interesting business models. We also, for a while, owned a small video game company that created Rock Band through an acquisition. And so I got to know a little bit about the video game world because of this property. In the middle of our vast, Viacom empire, there was a video game company. And so working with those teams to understand what those issues were really made it intriguing to see the marriage of music, film, television, animation, and technology in video games. And so when the opportunity availed itself to become general counsel of the Entertainment Software Association, I jumped at the chance. It meant moving from DC to New York and back now to DC, because I was in DC for my recording industry work, but I was in New York for Viacom, and Viacom's now Paramount. So they've changed to Paramount Global, but I came back to DC to come to the ESA. And it was really to marry all of the things I'd been learning into this new role where I was able to work on more technology focused issues, because video games are an art form expressed through technology. And not only are the game makers using technology, but the console makers and other device makers, where those games are being distributed, exploited, streamed, whatever is happening with the future of technology. And so coming to ESA meant I got to bring all of those different passions together into this new area for me. Even though I came in very familiar with a lot of the issues, the mindset of a game maker and a game developer is very different than a music maker or filmmaker. So it was another opportunity to stretch. And when there was an opening for the CEO role, I was encouraged to apply, and glad it worked out. But it wasn't the reason I came. It really was. I was passionate about the industry, about the opportunities, the issues, and the chance to really stretch my wings as general counsel.
You mentioned that there was something different about the creators of music or film or video gaming. Can you unpack that a little bit? I think people listening to this would actually be kind of curious about someone that has the experience you have, the perspective, and what's different about those three.
You see it a lot in how they express themselves. And so when you watch the Oscars, for example, there's nothing bigger than movie magic. And so there is a certain marketing and sales aspect of showing what it is. But when you see behind the scenes of a movie, it's very physical, it's very animated. And when someone's holding a grip, or you're filming something, there's something very visceral and relatable to what that is, because it's a very physically laborious task. And for the most part, since we dealt with live animation, when we dealt with live performance as opposed to animation, you're able to explain what you're doing to people. And there are certain aspects of the film industry that just require a lot of showmanship. And so where every show at night is a talk show, for example, is featuring someone promoting something that you should be seeing on Netflix or in the theaters or what have you. The music industry is a little different because a lot of the creativity happens behind the scenes. Again, it's a physical act for the most part. There are DJs and others who do a lot of electronic music, but the making of music is largely physical, but you're not watching people rehearse. But we have a lot of shows that take you behind the scenes about the stories of the music that impact us. And it's something that gets played around everywhere. You know, you don't need one device to play music. You walk into an elevator and it's playing. And so there's something ubiquitous about how music is exposed to us and how it impacts us and how we relate to it. And for songwriters and for artists, there's a certain persona. I think songwriters tend to be a little quieter and performers tend to be, not always, but tend to have larger personalities. They've got to be on stage. And so there's a stage persona you have, even though many of them may be introvert, shy behind the scenes, but there's a public aspect to what they do. I think in the video game world, you are putting together games in what's typically not a very physical activity. It is true we have mocap studios where you can put together the actions. And so that is certainly a thing that happens. You need voice actors, you need all those things to make the game alive. But a lot of the work happens at a computer screen and at a terminal. And so showing the behind the scenes is a little different, and it also attracts different personalities. And so you have to honor and respect how different those audiences expect, their companies to act or to be. And each audience is entirely different, even though there's a lot of cross-pollination between film, television, music, and video game audiences. At their core, there are some different personalities that make them up, and it makes them very unique and special. And I think that's what adds to the fun for us at ESA, where we get to work with lots of different kinds of personalities.
Definitely. And for those that might not be as familiar with the ESA and what it is, can you tell us the history of the trade association, how it's morphed since you've been there, and kind of where we're at today as a trade association with the ESA?
Well, trade associations in general serve a very interesting role for industries. Essentially, they act as a voice for an industry within the government or to the public, depending on what they're trying to do. So it's everything from lobbying in Congress or in the states about legislation that may impact them, or public ad campaigns like beef, it's what's for dinner, or pork, the other white meat. Those are all trade associations, maybe for cattle ranchers or what have you, who are trying to message to the public or to policymakers why they should like their industry or what are the benefits of an industry. You saw a lot of that during COVID, and pharma, which represent the pharmaceutical industry, trying to promote the work that pharmaceutical companies do for humanity, for society, for our culture, for the economy. The video game industry needed that in the mid-1990s. For a long time, the companies weren't collaborative in outreach to Congress or to the state governments. And as the game started having themes that some groups questioned, there was a need to pull together and act in unison. For us, it was the Mortal Kombat game where blood was coming out of someone's neck or head, and that alarmed some lawmakers because they heard from parents that they didn't want their kids seeing that. And the industry came together and did two things. One is they formed a lobbying organization, the ESA, to work with policymakers to understand the value of video games. They also formed a self-regulatory body called the ESRB, the Entertainment Software Rating Board. And they're the ones who provide you with the ratings that are categorized by age, E for everyone, E10, teen. They also provide information within each category so that you can see the descriptors. And then they explain if you have interactive elements within a game, you're online, there might be, payments within the game. They kind of give you signals about what the interactivity might be. And once that happened, it cemented for the federal government that the industry took this seriously, had regulated itself, and would continue to update its practices over time as needed by consumers, especially parents. And that has held steady for over 30 years now. They were both founded in 1994. So we're now in our 31st year. So I think that was a major reason that we were able to come together and advocate collaboratively. That didn't mean there weren't issues in the states. And in fact, there was a lot of state legislation and litigation until 2011, when the Supreme Court put a stop to the state legislation and just found that video games are subject to First Amendment protections, that there are literary works that have more disturbing themes than video games. So why are we singling out video games as opposed to other works? So that's the history of the group. And since then, we've spent time doing outreach to governments, to media, working with international organizations, and partnering with groups of similar stature in other countries so that we understand what's happening in other regions of the world.
I wasn't aware that the ESRB and the ESA started in the same year and were kind of done in conjunction together to accomplish a similar goal of advocacy, of making sure that the industry participants were being heard in Washington, but then also self-regulating with the ESRB. Between the ESRB and the ESA, is there any conflicts of interest between the two, as we're self-regulating and we're advocating? Does that exist today? Did it ever exist? Was it called into question?
Yeah, I think the industry has always been clear that they want self-regulatory guidelines so that they provide information to consumers, especially parents, about what's in the game. But they also wanted to make sure that Congress and the states understood the value that video games bring. So there's been a great appreciation and reliance on that self-regulatory model because it's been showcased as the gold standard by the Federal Trade Commission, for example, of any entertainment industry. They view what the video game industry has done as second to none. And in fact, when they used to do these mystery shopping programs where they'd send a teenager to a movie, or they'd send a teenager to buy a record or to buy a video game, they got stopped more for trying to buy a video game underage than anything else. And so it just showed not only was there a lot of clarity, but there was great training and enforcement and compliance within the video game industry. So it's something that the video game companies have taken very seriously because they want the right games to get to the right audiences. And they want to make sure the policymakers understand the seriousness with which they take the rating system, but also how to make sure that parents are getting the right information for their family needs and purchases.
Did I hear you right that the FTC looks at the video game industry as a gold standard in this regard around self-regulatory?
They have.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I didn't know that. How has that rippled into other industries that you've kind of watched? Or I'm sure people ping you being like, hey, what do you guys do in gaming how do you guys pull this off? Because we're trying to do the same.
Yeah, we've talked to a lot of other industries, and we've also seen that other industries are trying to catch up. So if you look at the proliferation of social media, they haven't had the same level of rigor behind creating rating systems. And I think they're looking to catch up. Some have their own mechanisms in place, but ours has really become standardized such that parents know this works. And whenever we do our polling around what parents' needs are, they view video games as second to none. In fact, in our most recent data, which we released last week, 70% of parents would rather their kids playing online on video games than in social media, because not only do we have the things that I just talked about the ratings and the information, we have parental tools that are in devices, including in consoles, where you can manage the amount of time spent, the amount of money spent, the kind of games that can get downloaded on your networks. And that's accessible through all the consoles for sure. And we have trust and safety mechanisms we build into our ecosystems. And so if there's a chat function, there's moderation occurring by humans, the use of technology to try to get ahead of issues that might surface. It's a constant workflow for our companies because in the end, we don't view trust and safety as a competitive issue between companies. It's one where we want to collaborate as an industry and make sure that consumers are getting the best experience possible, particularly if you're playing cross-platform. You want to be able to make sure that you're having a fun and safe experience everywhere you go.
I think I speak for many people, and I have a 1.5-year-old at home, and I'm nervous it would be generous, but more terrified of the future of social media for her. And then I have a second one on the way. And so like the world that they're growing up into, I think many people would share that sort of curation, oversight, and monitoring would be welcomed for social media. So I'm glad to hear that at least they're looking to video gaming. And you brought up some great points that video gaming does offer all these monitoring, curation, and the ESRB ratings. So that's a really great point. With all those things, what's the perception right now in Washington, D.C. around video gaming? What is the current pulse of regulators and lawmakers with video gaming today?
You know, because so many people play games and have played through their lives, it has changed the perception that people have about video games. obviously we've done a lot of advocacy around it. We've done a lot of outreach to policymakers. We've thrown events. We visit their offices. But I think a couple of things have really helped us along the way. One is, as people grow and continue to play, it's normalized for them. And so it's not this different thing that just the kids are doing. They were kids who were playing games. The average age of a video gamer today is 36 years old. About 50% of the people who play games are women, right? It changes by 1% here or there, but about 50-50 split. You have more people who are older who are playing games than ever. In fact, you have more people 50 years old and older playing than you do under 18. And 36% of those 80 and older are playing games in some way. A lot of times it might be games like bridge or puzzle games that they played in one format that have become online. And we have our first Pope ever who played video games. He played Wordle and Words with Friends with his brother every day when he was a cardinal in Peru as a way to escape everyday news and to kind of stay connected with family. So when you have the Pope playing video games in some way, shape, or form, it signals that it's been normalized. I think the second thing that's happened is COVID. During COVID, parents got to see their kids connecting with friends and family and relatives in a way that made it safe and complete to be together when we couldn't be physically together. And I think probably some of the younger parents started, dusting off the old consoles or what have you and playing games again, and also getting new games and going, wow, like this has changed since my days of Donkey Kong. This, photorealistic experience is second to none, or this kind of open world is very different than my Pac-Man game. So I think during COVID, a lot of people were reintroduced to games and it has stuck, right? The engagement remains high and people love the games they play. So I think when you go to an average member of Congress, if you get a derisive question, all you have to say is, does anyone in your life play video games? And since 2/3 of Americans play games at least an hour a week, someone in their life is playing a video game. And that helps humanize the experience in the conversation.
In those conversations, what are the current most hotly debated policies around gaming today that not only industry participants that are listening to this would be interested in hearing about, but things that are probably going to stick here for a while, right? That this isn't going to be solved overnight. Curious what those big tension points are in DC right now with gaming.
Well, the great news about video games is we are rarely singled out these days. There was a moment in time, as I said before, where games were potentially regulated. And then when the federal threat went away, it stuck around the states for a long time. And in the states, you do get a few issues that appear, but most of the concern that regulators have are whatever they feel in their constituency. And right now, every parent wants safety online to be paramount. So we spend a lot of time trying to outline all of the things we put into place and why games are different than social media and other online experiences. And that's really resonated because when you have either members of Congress or their staff who play games, they could speak from their own experience. When we start talking about the protocols within games and the safety measures, it resonates. And then when we talk about the impact games have, the fact that it brings people together, it actually relieves and reduces stress. It engages people. In fact, older Americans find that it engages their minds in ways that they want. And when you see academic studies talking about how games have a positive aspect on mental well-being, it helps to shape that story in a different way than other media online these days. And so we spend a lot of our time trying to show that distinction, because as they start to regulate, the language within a bill sweeps everyone in. And the goal is to understand why you don't want to overcomplicate it. If you look at AI today, for example, video games have incorporated some version of AI for over a decade. And a lot of the conversation today has been on generative AI and what that means. You don't want the regulations where they're concerned about what's happening with, generative AI seeping back and taking away the opportunities that games have afforded consumers and players everywhere. And so we spent a lot of time explaining the development of some of these technologies and also the breadth. Like some of the language would stop your Google Maps from working, and you're talking to a state legislator and they go, well, I like my Google Maps, or I like my weather app. Well, part of the thing that powers it is diminished by the language in this bill. So we spent a lot of time trying to outline how to think crystal clear about what you're trying to address, as opposed to just, I want to make the internet safe and here's my internet safety bill. Let's What are the particular measures that impact the areas of concern? And so that takes some time. And it also takes us talking to our companies to understand their technology and how it works in a way that's translatable to a generalist on the Hill.
And what does that process look like day to day for you? So lawmakers bring something to the House or the Senate. There's some verbiage in there that covers the video game industry. You guys have a lot of experience and you can probably advocate for part of that to change or not change. What does it look like talking back to the industry and then coming back with new intel? That's one side. And then the other side is new video game company has incredibly new platform or piece of technology that's really pushing the industry forward, and then translating that to the people in DC to say, hey, this is coming. This is what it means. Don't be afraid of it like Gen AI or some new piece of technology, but this is what it's probably going to impact your constituency. How does your day-to-day look on those two fronts?
Yeah. So on part one, bill comes down. The first thing we'll do is do some outreach to make sure we understand the goal that the legislator or the regulator has so that we're understanding its premise. Sometimes there's a bill that's trying to address something very narrow in a particular region. It might be in a state and they're concerned about X, Y, or Z. So what's the goal and what's the likelihood that this is going to gain some traction? And then we do an analysis based on what we've seen, what we know our members might care about. And then we share that with them and walk through the process of, are these things that we're going to have to oppose? Are they things that we think we can help address? Are they practices that we're seeing in other countries, frankly, that our companies might already be complying with? In which case, why are we pressing here if you're already doing this thing? So, but whenever you have a group, you have different positions that emerge. It's never just one thing. And once you arrive at a consensus, you try to address that with the legislator or the staff of the legislator to say, here are things that work for us, here are things that don't, and how do we get there? And so there's some back and forth, and sometimes they've got to figure out who within the company has that expertise, because it could be a wide array of things. I think going the other way, when we're aware that something new is coming out, we want to make sure we showcase it to members of Congress or in the states before it becomes an issue, because it's better to have people sensitized to the issues so that as you're thinking of regulating an area, they are already aware of the hot button issues. And so if there's a new game, sometimes we want to showcase it. We've done online webinars where we talk about everything from how a game gets made to how a game gets, QA'd. And, a couple weeks ago, we did a demo on Capitol Hill of a variety of games just to show the educational and accessibility impact that games have on society. And each year we might have a different theme, but we want to make sure that we're creating those touches so that they're seeing how games are developing and how they impact their communities or audiences and the like. And it's symbiotic. You just want that to be happening all the time in both directions so that when there is an issue, you're able to, go back and talk about the areas that you've already showcased. So usually there are 3 or 4 or 5 things that are hot in the moment, but you also want to maintain the conversation because that's how you affect change.
I mean, one of those has to be AI right now. How are you communicating how AI is affecting the gaming industry to lawmakers and policymakers?
Well, first you want to talk about the fact that video games have incorporated some version of AI, even if it's early AI or some other kind of learning methodology, and they can understand the development. You want to demo it if you can, or demo some of the areas that are in development. We've also seen in the AI world non-playable characters. What's their role in the game and how is it developed? And what are things you can use AI to do to enhance gameplay or the gameplay experience for each individual user? You're not saying the same thing every time. So you just talk about those use cases, and that really humanizes the experience in the conversation. Just talking about AI as AI can be a little blurring, but if you talk about the use case and why it's relevant to game development, it makes it more real, and it makes the conversation more meaningful when they're thinking about how to legislate, because they may be really concerned about the large language learning model, but they don't impact all of the follow-on effects by regulating something at that high stage.
You a few times have mentioned international regulators or international law. How have we learned? How are we better? How are we behind the ball in the United States versus other jurisdictions that you track? And which ones do you track the most right now, good or bad?
I never look at it as good or bad. I just view it as every region of the world has a different sensibility. So the US tends to be less regulatory ahead of time. It tends to respond to the need and tries to address it in as specific a way possible. Whereas in Europe or Asia, for example, they tend to regulate first. And then if it's overregulated, it maybe loosens up a bit or it gets adjusted or revised. And so you just have to know in different regions of the world, there might be a different approach as to how you regulate and why you regulate that aspect or other. And there are some issues that get hotter in some areas than others, and part of that is historical. So Europe has a very big history in terms of privacy harms through 2 world wars and occupations, secret police. And so privacy regulation is sacrosanct because of the personal impact that was felt in the region. The US was always a place for escaping totalitarianism, whether it's religious freedom, political freedom, all those things. And so there tends to be a different way to think about regulation just because this is a country of people who came leaving totalitarian states or overly regulatory states. And so our history of regulation is just very different. So you just have to know that's usually the methodology. And so if you're thinking about a European context, it's going to be more aggressive on regulation or on regulating monetary but monetary policy, those types of things. So you just get to know the rhythms a little bit differently.
That's so interesting. I've never heard it so succinctly put. It makes total sense. It's ingrained into the history of these regions and countries and the people, right? And it's really these people that elect lawmakers and the lawmakers then decide. So at the end of the day, it's people that are living in historical context. That's so interesting. Before we move to E3, and definitely want to talk about Icon, can you share a little bit more around what's your advice to gaming industry participants, whether it's a studio or a platform or an investor or someone in the legal profession servicing the space or many others? What's your advice to them on how to think about lawmaking around video gaming in DC and how to maybe interact or not interact with everything that's going on in Washington, D.C.?
What I tell everyone who's associated with the industry in any way, shape, or form, including parents, is you're an advocate. And think of yourself as an advocate because the steps you take, the things you make, the things you defend, all go towards promoting this great industry. And so what are the things you can do to arm yourself with that information, with the information you need and the practice that you have? And so to think about the work you do as you being an ambassador of industry, because it comes everywhere. It happens in Capitol Hill, but it also might happen at a PTA meeting where a parent might have misinformation about the impact of games, and you're able to arm yourself with information either from our website or other places to say, actually, in a 2014 study, they found that 14 and 15-year-olds who played games were less stressed and exhibited less anxiety than kids who didn't, right? Or in the STEM field, girls who played video games growing up are 3 times as likely to get a STEM degree than those who didn't. And so there are things about games that you can arm yourself with. Sometimes they're little facts and sometimes there's personal experience. So I think first and foremost, just view yourself as an advocate because this is a great industry. It's a great pastime. It's a great hobby. And, when someone pulls out a Nintendo Switch 2 on the plane, that should be just as applauded as a book or an iPad. And that's the point at which we will see video games gaining that notoriety of being a fun and educational pastime that everyone should be enjoying. So I think that's first and foremost. I think second beyond that is understanding what your role is in the industry and maximizing it, because everyone is adding to the growth of the industry in some way, shape, or form. It's not all linear. Growth happens through a series of steps. Sometimes it's a legal win. Sometimes it's a technological win. Sometimes it's seeing the growth that video game storytelling has reached. So now you've got major motion pictures that are based on video game themes and stories that are blockbuster, right? It's not just we're making a movie. It's the Minecraft movie. It's Super Mario Brothers. You're seeing Last of Us on HBO. You're seeing Arcane on Netflix. You're seeing Fallout on Prime Video. So video games are cross-pollinating in a very powerful way. And that comes from the ingenuity of the game and the storytelling, but also people thinking outside the box and saying, maybe there's an opportunity to make something special from these themes. So I really think it's about maximizing the potential of what you're doing within the industry.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of people need to hear that because it kind of sets the perspective a little different, where some people are like, oh, I don't really have a role to play here. but really we do, right? Whether it's with the parents at the school where your kids go to, or whether you are the CEO of one of the largest gaming companies, anywhere in between. And I think that's just really well said. Thanks for phrasing it that way.
It's funny. We were in a government meeting and I asked people, does anyone in your life play video games? And someone said, it's funny you say that. I would think no, but I took my mom to the doctor last week and we were in the waiting room and she whipped out her phone and started playing Candy Crush, and she's in her 80s, right? And so I think that simple little question changes the conversation enormously and changes the tenor of where it goes. And that's not just a lobbying pitch. That's just everyday life.
Yeah. Well said. Switching over to the consumer side a little bit with E3. So E3 was for decades just an incredible tenet of the video game industry, where consumers could show up in LA, see early game releases or try things out before it hit the market. And there was a lot of inertia. And that conference was run by the ESA for decades. COVID kind of accelerated that and probably shut that down pretty quickly. And it hasn't come back. And then we're going to talk about iicon, which is your new summit that you're launching with. But can you tell us a little bit of the history of E3, the story of why it shut down, why it's not coming back, and why we're kind of pivoting to a new chapter for the ESA and when it comes to conferences and summits?
Well, E3 started off as part of another trade show, believe it or not. And we were part of the Consumer Electronics Show back in the day. And as the show was growing, video games were put further away from the center of the action. And at some point, the video game industry felt like they had enough of a footing in the marketplace that they could host their own show. And when they put that together, they had formed ESA and felt that ESA could also run the show collaboratively, because it's much easier as a trade association to convene your members than for them to do it themselves. There are moments where they're doing their own deals and they have marketing and business relationships, but pulling together big events or meetings that are cross industry in many ways is a sweet spot for trade associations. And so they asked ESA to run the trade show. Enormously successful. And the history of it really was trying to showcase to retailers what was coming down the pike. So if I could tell you in June what you should expect, you could put your orders in. I could get it on a pallet into your stores in September in time for the fourth quarter sales. That was really the beginning. It's a retailer sales opportunity, but also big announcements about games and about products, about new consoles. And it proved to be enormously successful. I think as the world became more digital, as companies started distributing more online, as games could be made any time of year and released any time of year, it posed a challenge to companies about how much do you support this model where there are lots of ways to reach consumers, and particularly as retail started declining, how much do you invest in this apparatus that was made for a prior era, but we've hung on to? And I think what COVID did was accelerate a lot of that decision-making, because companies started having online showcases and reaching the consumers that they wanted to reach. Now, one of the benefits of E3 was that everyone focused on the industry during that week, and it made for a great opportunity to capture fans who might have preferences for one game or for one company or have loyalty with one or the other, to see what else was going on. And so there was a shining of a light in that period that was really special for our industry. And it also gave us a halo effect of others outside the industry seeing what the industry was about, seeing what the games were, the passion and commitment around the industry. So it served an enormously great purpose. But as you got out of COVID and companies saw the benefit of doing different kinds of showcases and maybe not convening everyone in one place at one time, it made the case for E3 tougher. It was still a very successful event to host, but I think because there were new methods of doing outreach, sunsetting that important event became the practical reality. We spent some time after shutting down E3 to think about what might be a useful next step for industry, if one at all, because as a trade association, we only want to do things that benefit the industry and our members. And what we saw was a gap in the opportunity for thought leaders to talk about the impact of games, not only within our industry, but beyond. And that really is what motivated us to announce the Interactive Innovation Conference, iicon, which we will host for the first time next April in Las Vegas. It's an opportunity for us to bring leaders from a variety of industries that are relying on interactive entertainment and to showcase what it's done and what it can do in the future. Yesterday I saw an announcement that the NBA, the National Basketball Association, had formed a new entity with Take-Two, the maker of Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead Redemption, the 2K series, in a new joint venture called NBA Take-Two Media, where they're looking not only at video games, but how do you create immersive experiences for consumers of the video game and consumers of the NBA products. And that's exactly the kinds of things we're looking to showcase. What are these cross collaborations in finance, in health, in education, where video game technology is fueling growth in other areas? We talked earlier about the television and other entertainment programming. Same with music. There are a lot of artists who are releasing new music or hosting concerts on video game platforms and seeing larger audiences in one night than they would on a world tour. How do we talk about that growth and that mechanism writ large? And that's what iicon is looking to really showcase.
It's awesome. What do you hope iicon becomes over the next 5 years or so?
We really want business leaders, education leaders, and thought leaders generally to view this as a space to talk about the growth of interactive entertainment and to talk about what they're thinking about and the future that they see in this technology. So we want it to be a home for those discussions. There's no place for it to happen right now. There are some great showcases and events for the video game industry that happen throughout the year on a global basis. Each of them focuses on the video game sector solely. We want this to be a cross-collaborative moment for our industry.
I like that approach because another video game conference might be duplicative with some other great ones around the world. But this sort of cross-industry collaboration and thought leadership sounds like something that really is missing in the space today. Because, you're either going to a fintech conference or you're going to a gaming conference. But the thought leader in the middle that's creating innovation, that doesn't really exist. So I think this is really cool. I think the industry is going to get a lot out of this for sure. Is there going to be a way for people to kind of tune in and listen? Of course, probably won't have 200,000 people at this conference. Correct me if I'm wrong, but is there a way for people to learn more, watch online or anything like that?
For now, it's a live conference because we want to make sure we have a great audience experience and a great networking experience for those who are there. There might be some opportunities for some of the materials that are created while there to get some, second life within the online world. But right now we've been focused on getting people into the room because we want it to be a dynamic conversation. We want great keynotes, but we also want great roundtables, and we want people to be able to network because that's a lot of the value. Because if you're in an industry looking to reach an audience and want to learn more from the video game sector and how we've done it so effectively, you want that natural, organic conversation to emerge and the follow-up and the business relations potentially to really emerge from that moment. So for now, it's a live conference. There may be opportunities to use segments of it for other purposes, but we've been focused on really creating a great event for people to be there and not just have their phones out, but actually be enjoying the conversation.
That's great. Maybe people can check in their phones. That'd be a great feature, but of course, that would never fly in a tech-enabled world. Couple last questions I want to ask you about, Stan, and thank you so much for doing this. This has been super interesting. One, emerging technologies that are top of mind. We talked about AI. Are there any other emerging technologies that just are popping up for you daily? And then additional to that, what's your vision for the ESA over the next, 5 to 10 years, iicon included, but, more broadly, policymaking at the intersection of video gaming?
In terms of the emerging technologies, AI has been the number one conversation piece at the state and federal level, and I would say probably emerging on the global level as well, depending on which region of the world you're in and how quickly it's developing there. Only because it leads to so many other innovations and it impacts so many other areas of how do you develop games and what does that mean in terms of workforce and all of those questions that flow from it. So that's definitely the hot topic. Online safety continues to be an important topic because that emerges in different ways, and the protection tools as well. So those are probably the biggest things that are the themes that anywhere you'd go in the US and most places abroad, you're going to hear a conversation about, and then there are other smaller conversations, not small, but smaller than those, around monetization and around other areas, just to make sure that, video games are protected in the best possible way. I think in terms of what we want for ESA is really for the industry to continue its momentum of being a highly respected and sought after industry in terms of workforce, but also in terms of thought leadership. And that's on policy issues, that's on business issues, and that's on the economy. How do we show the growth model that we've created as an industry and sustained for decades? How do we showcase that to the world in such a way that it benefits others so that they learn from it, but also it puts us in our rightful place as thought leaders at the political, economic, and social level.
That's awesome. Well, excited to watch that unfold for sure. And thank you for all that you do for the industry. One last question on a personal note. I noticed that you're on the board of directors for the National Symphony Orchestra. Can you just share more about that? And it sounds like you grew up playing an instrument or multiples. And how did you get on that board of directors?
Yeah, I grew up playing musical instruments, piano and bass principally, but I was involved in musical theater, all kinds of different groups, and it was always fun. I maintained that through college, through law school, and then you get into the work world and you've got to make different choices about how much time you spend in these different areas. But I still go to a lot of concerts, and I go to pop concerts, jazz concerts, classical. I went to everything. And at some point you end up in conversations in DC or anywhere you go about different passions that you have. And I just happened to have a conversation with someone at the right time, around the time they were looking to add board members, and said, would you be interested in working with the National Symphony? It was right before COVID. And so it's been interesting managing that process through COVID. How do you deal with a performing arts organization where people can't come to concerts? And what does that mean in terms of online play and the relationship with the artists? And so there have just been enormous challenges in that world, because now that you're back from COVID, you've got arts funding challenges now. So you're always trying to stay a step ahead of the challenges. But at the end of the day, it's about the great performers and the music that they play. And so just as much as I love video games and the work that our companies do, I'm also passionate about various types of music, including the work that the National Symphony Orchestra does.
That's so cool. And what a time to join them. So that's what an interesting last 6 years it's been doing that. If people want to reach out to the ESA or get in touch with you, what would be the best way to work with you at the ESA?
Well, we have all our contact information on our website at theesa.com, theesa.com. I'm on LinkedIn, and ESA is also on LinkedIn. And we're also on other social media platforms, so it's not hard to reach us.
Perfect. Well, Stan, thank you so much for all that you and your whole team do for our industry behind the scenes that I think most people are unaware of, but thank you for it regardless, and really appreciate you coming on the show today, and thank you so much.